Good evening and welcome to the report. I'm John Rees. The Iraqi Prime Minister has said he will take the country's president to court for what he describes as violating constitutional rules. Nouri al-Maliki criticised President Fuad Masum for not intervening after Parliament failed to grant him a third term as Prime Minister. There are calls for al-Maliki to step down as an insurgency hits the north of Iraq. Octavia Bell has been following the developments.
Fears over a battle for power in Iraq's government are today showing little sign of abating. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has accused the president of attempting a coup, while the Prime Minister appears himself to be attempting to hold on to power. It was announced on Iraq's state television that an Iraqi court had ruled that Maliki's bloc forms the largest group in Iraq's parliament. This was denied earlier today by a court spokesperson. There have been disagreements in the country's government about the selection of a Prime Minister, and Maliki has indicated that he wishes to run for a third term. Iraq's president has today asked the Shia coalition's nominee for Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, to form a government. The move comes after months of political wrangling and is likely to be resisted by al-Maliki. Last night, Maliki gave a televised speech announcing that he will take Iraq's President Masum to court.
I will submit today an official complaint to the Federal Court against the President of the Republic for committing a clear constitutional violation for the sake of political calculations and for giving priority to the interests of some groups at the expense of the higher interests of the Iraqi people.
Last week, US President Barack Obama authorized airstrikes on IS militants in northern Iraq. The airstrikes were aimed at aiding Kurdish troops in preventing the IS from taking further control of the region. The decision was taken as members of Iraq's Yazidi religious group were trapped on Mount Sinjar after fleeing IS fighters. Many hundreds have died from dehydration on the mountain, as well as thousands who have been directly killed or captured by IS. British planes have been among those delivering aid parcels to those stuck on the mountain. Meanwhile, President Barack Obama has indicated that there is no timetable to ending US involvement in the region. Octavia Bell, Islam Channel.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Paul Schulte, who's Defence Specialist and an Honorary Professor at the University of Birmingham, and also by Dr Rebwar Fatah, the Director of the Middle East Consultancy Services. Welcome to you both. Paul, so we've all heard about the huge territorial gains that what's now called the Islamic State have made. Can they hold on to them?
I think they've been pushed back slightly in the last few hours. They've lost a couple of minor towns. But the real test hasn't come yet. The real test will come when the Kurds are better armed and when the Iraqi Air Force begins to build up with deliveries which the Americans had ill-advisedly held back for months. Plus, they get better support from American air power and American special forces on the ground. Now, that's a package which could begin to make a difference, but that won't happen for several weeks, maybe a few months yet.
Rebwar, do you think that's the case? I mean, we've heard President Obama saying that he's giving arms to the Kurds now. There's, as Paul says, the airstrikes, special forces on the ground. Is that enough for the Kurds to push back?
I think the problem is not just a military problem. I think it's also a political problem. I'm sure ISIL will be pushed back into probably where they were previously, but whether you can bring Sunnis in Iraq, Sunni Arabs in Iraq into political negotiation, I think still probably that has to happen. I mean, the situation in Iraq is very, very complicated, and I don't believe by bombing ISIS, which is what it is called these days, will solve the problem.
Paul, do you think it will just push the problem across the border? Because what some commentators are saying is, OK, if the Islamic State is facing American armed Kurds and other forces in Iraq, it'll simply refocus its efforts in Syria and perhaps take Aleppo?
That's possible, but the whole... then in a way it becomes a Russian problem, that they will step up arms and assistance, and the Iranians will send in more IRGC people to help Assad. So it's not obvious that IS can achieve major gains quickly. But I do think there's a real problem. I mean, I think we're both right in what we've said. You're completely right that there has to be a political solution which involves bringing back the Sunni into some kind of national consensus and with a sense of identification with the new state. Although probably a new state minus Kurdistan. But that's not going to happen until there is some military response which pushes ISIS back, because until they're out, not much can begin to achieve. There's total national military emergency. Well, that's going.
I mean, I agree with you can't do really much unless you bring peace into the country. You know, the country is in chaos. I don't know whether you can describe it by civil war. I don't really know. But while the country is in chaos, especially now, and ICE moving across and, you know, getting rid of all these different ethnic and religious groups, it will be very, very difficult to do anything politically. And it's catch-22, it really is, because unless you have a political settlement, you can't solve the problem. And you cannot have a political settlement unless you have peace in the country.
Well, I mean, this is a rock and a hard place, isn't it, Paul? Because, I mean, the other news, of course, is from Baghdad, where Maliki is basically involved in a kind of power struggle now over the kind of rump bit of this part of Iraq. So, I mean, you can say we need peace before we have a political settlement, but a political settlement with what?
Well, I think Maliki is proving that he's even more divisive and irresponsible than one had thought, because he's now abandoned by the Americans. He seems to have had the plug pulled by the Iranians. He's lost enormous credibility, not only with the Sunni, but the Shia. And he's still insisting he needs to be the only Prime Minister the country's ever allowed to have. So I just don't think that that's going to persist. I think he'll be given the push. But until that happens and until there is a new government, I agree, it's a mess. But meanwhile, the Iraqi army will at least hold the line, although it may not attack with much vigor, but then it hasn't got the equipment to do that yet. That's on its way. And the Shia militias aren't going to melt away, because they really don't want ISIS coming further south. So the political meltdown that's going on in Baghdad is unquestionably bad, but it doesn't mean a disintegration of the Iraqi government position.
Do you think that's the case? Because, I mean, a lot of commentators are saying Iraq's over as a single unitary state, that we're going to have an autonomous Kurdistan in the north, a Sunni area in the middle, and an Iranian-influenced Shia state in the south. Do you think we're looking at the breakup of Iraq?
I think now on the ground, Iraq of course is in three pieces. You have Islamic State, you have Kurds, and you have Shia in the south. I think that's no doubt now on the ground. Of course, these are not states, but you like to know they have their own sovereignty and they have army, whatever you call it. I mean, they behave as different states, except for ISIS, which is like being defined as a terrorist group. I mean, they are insurgent groups. What we are looking at, I mean, Kurdistan has been out of Iraqi power since 1991, since March 1991, and it will be very difficult to integrate back to Iraq. Even if it integrates back to Iraq, it will be on some sort of maybe under a loose government in Baghdad, which may not be a bad solution, also to bring Sunni regions into Iraqi control. But looking from now, it depends for how long Islamic State will stay in power in that region. Probably the important question is, can they act as the Kurds did and restore their own or keep their own autonomous region for a few years to come? I mean, that's
Do you think that's possible, Paul? Because, I mean, you know, the Kurds had a long political history. They were, you know, a relatively disciplined political entity. They were, in many people's views, a national liberation movement that was aiming for its own state. Yeah. Very little of that could be said of ISIS.
Yeah, and they don't have mountains either, which doesn't. I mean, it'll be one of these desert empires that erupts and doesn't persist. I think that I mean, I can see that they will try very hard to hold on to major Sunni centres like Fallujah and Ramadi, and I fear that those places are going to get destroyed again, because the ISIS will stand and fight there. But nonetheless, I think they will begin to collapse fairly quickly once they get into a sort of high-tech meat grinder, air power, artillery, and all that stuff focused by American high-tech intelligence and special forces with laser on the ground.
Well, that's one argument, but might there not be another argument that facing that kind of onslaught, the kind of temporary alliance between the Sunni insurgency, which many people think is the core of this and not the ISIS fighters themselves, that this will glue that together, or perhaps make the Sunni insurgency the main force which the Americans yet again are having to deal with?
I mean, I agree that like ISIS is like a coalition of different Sunni insurgent groups, including former Ba'athis, jihadis, and so on, and some Arab nationalists too. But for some reason, it appears that ISIS controlling, maybe because they have more power than the rest, and maybe they have foreign insurgency with them, their hardline, and also probably they get regional support. That's why they can undermine the other groups. Now they are fighting, that's why the coalition is holding, although it's breaking places because they stopped beheading the former Ba'athists, if you like. Whether that coalition can hold, I think I said this before, as long as they are fighting a common enemy or common enemies like Kurds and Shias in Baghdad, that can hold together. But once they relax and start ruling, which I don't know whether they're going to relax, then they will break up.
And on every previous occasion, the way that extreme Islamists have tried to rule creates violent resistance from the people that they control.
But isn't that the case for not having military intervention? Because precisely that scenario won't occur while they're having to fight American armed forces.
But that would imply just kind of doing nothing, accepting that there's a front line and that all the initiative lies with the IS people. That's very hard for an Iraqi government to accept with credibility. It's sort of saying, we can't do anything, we'll wait for you to begin to collapse. And it may not happen that quickly. There will probably be violence and struggle within those territories. The Nashqubandi army is apparently restless, and there are these struggles with the former Ba'athists who've played this strange behind-the-scenes role. It doesn't mean they'll lose control, though, unless they're under pressure, and there will be immense reasons to put them under pressure. And there'll be the back channels and spooks and special forces trying to get in, and the Iranians will be part of this, trying to work on those divisions inside that area called the IS.
One moving towards a conclusion now, one quick question. Wouldn't another policy be to say to the Turks, you haven't sealed that border, it's 500 miles long, ISIS are going back and forward apart it, the Gulf states have been at least funding and supporting them. Wouldn't an alternative policy be to say, look, cut this out, you're funding a monster that's running out of control?
I totally agree with that, but you have those states, which we can name them, is Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia supporting ISIS. But I think in one way, ISIS was very, very effective in the way, I think we discussed this before, to break this Shia crescent, so-called, from Iran to Iraq to Syria and to Hezbollah. So it was very, very effective. And that's politics for you in the Middle East. If they can get a group of hard-line insurgents that break up that Iranian policy, or if you like, Shia policy that's been built for years and years, is very effective. Whether these states are going to get together, say, now we have achieved our political aim, we don't want this anymore, I don't think it will be that easy.
OK, Rebwar, Paul, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks for coming in. We're going to take our first break of the evening, but do join us after that when we'll be discussing the implications of Turkey's first ever direct presidential elections. That's after the break. Do rejoin us.